Hedrick Smith discusses Russian politics and the economic climate in that country. American Perspectives continues now with syndicated columnist William Rusher. He talks about the state of the conservative movement and the social and political impacts of religion on society. He spoke in April at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C.
Again, we began this series of lectures in the fall of 1995. Since that time, we've had a number of lectures on what Russell Kirk called the permanent things, such as community, religion, knowledge, literature, history, virtue, and the family. We're very pleased indeed that these lectures have mostly been delivered by young conservative scholars from around the nation. For example, David Patterson of Oklahoma State University on the subject Homer, Shakespeare, and Tolstoy, What Literature Teaches About the Collapse and the Recovery of the Family. Wilfred McClay of Tulane University on the mystic chords of memory, reclaiming America's history. Professor John West of Seattle Pacific University on God and Politics, learning from America's past. Matthew Frank of Radford University on restoring the constitutional role of the judicial branch. Interspersed also have been some lectures by those who have been working throughout their lives to maintain the conservative flame in the political arena. We began this series when Michigan Governor John Engler spoke about first principles in the political arena. Senator Spence Abraham of Michigan spoke on reclaiming the conservative Constitution. And our own Annette Kirk spoke about My Life with Russell Kirk. Well, this evening we are very pleased indeed to have another lecturer in our series, and his theme will be Conservatism's Third and Final Battle. Bill Rusher, in fact, falls into both categories of lecturers. President Reagan once said about Bill Rusher, "He is an energetic and articulate champion of the principles we believe in so deeply." Today, Bill is as energetic and articulate as ever, and he could run intellectual circles around most professors at our elite institutions of learning. In fact, he has, recently when he spoke about the conservative revival at his own alma mater at Princeton University. But it is as one of the most important spokesmen for the conservative viewpoint that he has been so well known over the last 40 years. From 1957 until 1988, he was publisher of National Review magazine. He was one of the three men who in 1961 launched the draft Barry Goldwater movement. That in turn eventually led to the triumph of Ronald Reagan. Bill is familiar to all of you as a television and radio personality, having hosted The Advocates for many years. He has been a newspaper columnist for more than 25 years. His column, The Conservative Advocate, is syndicated weekly, and he is the author of 5 books, including The Making of the New Majority Party and The Rise of the Right. Currently, we are very pleased that he serves as a distinguished fellow at our sister institution, the Claremont Institute in California. And I invite you to please join me at this time in welcoming William Rusher to give our first Kirk Lecture of 1998. Bill?
President Ed, Annette, ladies and gentlemen. I have been lecturing professionally for about almost 40 years now, and some years ago achieved my ambition to have lectured in all 50 states of the Union. The last 2 states to be popped into my creel were Alaska and Wyoming. And I will confess that the fee I was charging in those days had to be pared a bit as an extra inducement to the sponsors. But at last, the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and the University of Wyoming in Laramie came through with invitations, and I felt rather as if I had finished the New York Times crossword puzzle. Now my achievement is threatened by Puerto Rico's bid for statehood. If it succeeds, I guess I will have to somehow finagle an invitation to speak for pay in San Juan. But at my age and in the absence of any other TV engagements to restore my badly diminished luster, that may be difficult. But other gratifications are still available to me. In May 1996, to my astonishment, a couple of junior history types at my old school, Princeton, managed to get a conference on American conservatism so far along in the planning stage that the heavyweights in the history department, when they finally realized what was happening, were unable to stop it. The sponsors then boldly asked me to give the keynote address. As I remarked at the time, that was rather like a bunch of paleontologists deciding to hold a conference on dinosaurs and then finding a real live velociraptor to give the keynote address. I have rarely enjoyed anything so much in my life. But that was a relatively minor honor compared to being asked to give the Russell Kirk Lecture at the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation, as just about everybody realizes by now, is and has been for years the beating heart of the American conservative movement. Russell Kirk, whom I had the privilege to know for more than 3 decades, is one of the unquestioned icons of that movement. Every account of the conservative movement must begin with its intellectual origins in 2 quite different and by no means always comfortably compatible sets of beliefs. The doctrines of classical liberalism, grounded in the British Enlightenment's emphasis on political and economic freedom, and the far older tradition that derives its core principles from our Judeo-Christian heritage itself. In the United States, as the 20th century approached its midpoint, both were discouragingly out of fashion. But classical liberalism never lacked for assertive spokesmen and passionate defenders. And in the field of economics, the so-called Austrian school of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek maintained a distinction that even its worst critics were hard put to deny. It was traditionalism, Burkean traditionalism as it was often called, that seemed to have no advocates at all. When Russell Kirk published The Conservative Mind in 1953, his bibliography was impressively detailed but pathetically short of works published after 1900. His very chapter headings, as his narrative approached the 20th century, told the story. Conservatism frustrated America 1865-1918. English conservatism adrift, the 20th century, and so on. But Kirk's great book was to change all that, and to change it, what's more, for all practical purposes, single-handedly. This young professor of history at Michigan State had studied deeply and analyzed the world profoundly. He was not unduly impressed with the Enlightenment. His mind reached back behind it, deep into the Christian centuries that had constructed and defined the Western world. It was there that he found the principles he would proclaim and by which he meant to live. As the first canon of conservative thought, he posited the proposition that a divine intent rules society as well as conscience, forging an eternal chain of right and duty which links great and obscure, living and dead. Political problems at bottom are religious and moral problems. It was a rich loam indeed in which Russell Kirk found the roots of what he taught the world to call conservatism. Without question, we owe a great deal to Whittaker Chambers, who persuaded his fellow editors at Time to devote a major portion of an issue of the magazine to this profoundly important book. But no amount of hyping, even by Time, could possibly have made The Conservative Mind the success it became, or decree the immense effect it was to have. The Conservative Mind resonated in many thousands of hearts because it filled a mighty void. To a world fresh from one immensely bloody war and already gripped in the icy embrace of another, both fought against despotisms that professed to know what was best for mankind. Russell Kirk offered a faith that was far deeper and far truer. He found it, moreover, not in the implications of some new scientific discovery or some catchy social theory, but in the long and honorable past of our own civilization. As we now know, the subsequent intellectual history of the conservative movement has largely been the story of how the two great strands of conservative thought, classical liberalism and Burkean traditionalism, the blue and white Niles of the conservative movement, as I have sometimes called them, have come to recognize each other not as adversaries, but as complementary aspects of a single overarching worldview. To borrow a military metaphor, it has sometimes seemed to me that the conservative movement's resolute opposition to the advance of world communism was its response to the great but essentially tactical problem of our time. Its commitment to political and economic freedom, the contribution of classical liberalism, as we have seen, was its profound strategic contribution. The enormously important insight that human freedom makes possible a level of political and economic well-being that no dirigiste system can hope to equal. But Russell Kirk's traditionalism is neither a strategy nor a tactic. It is, in the fullest sense of the word, a philosophy. As such, it is the bedrock of American conservatism. It is nearly 50 years now since American conservatives, becoming aware of themselves and each other, and drawing on the works of Hayek, Kirk, and Chambers, launched the great intellectual and ultimately political enterprise called the conservative movement. Now, conservatives are, in general, a rather saturnine bunch. In the earliest days of the movement, we learned the ashy taste of defeat. And when, in the fullness of time, victories began to come our way, first just one or two, and then ultimately victories beyond imagination or measure, we morosely refused to admit that anything had changed very much. Like Evelyn Waugh, we complained that our political representatives, for all their vaunted success, hadn't managed to turn the clock back by so much as a single minute. We pointed out that the national debt was still rising, that the federal budgets were still expanding, and that taxes overall were still increasing. All of these things are still true, and all are deplorable. But it takes a very selective analysis of the state of our nation to conclude that conservatives therefore have little or nothing to cheer about. Just for one thing, the conservative movement's steadfast opposition to the advance of world communism has culminated in the near total collapse of the foe. For another, over the past quarter century, it has become plain to just about everyone that economic freedom deserves to rank with political democracy as one of the fundamental preconditions of human happiness. Socialism, in all its forms and guises, has joined communism on the ash heap of history. In other words, both conservatism's major tactical initiative and its central strategic insight have been validated by victories that 3 decades ago would have been derided as unimaginable. And all this has happened in our time, right before our eyes, and with our happy complicity. So I don't share the usual conservative appetite for doom and gloom. No doubt this is in part simply a temperamental idiosyncrasy. The glass is always both half full and half empty. This is the best of all possible worlds, chirps the optimist. Yes, groans the pessimist, I'm afraid you're right. But it is a sin against reality itself, it seems to me, not to admit and rejoice in the fact that in its first half-century conservatism has won 2 of the 3 great battles it was founded to wage. It is the third battle, Russell Kirk's battle, the philosophical battle between post-Enlightenment modernity and the Judeo-Christian tradition that is still going on. It is hardly surprising that this should be what the communist hymn, the Internationale, called La lutte finale, the final conflict, for it involves mankind's deepest convictions. The opening paragraph of Chapter 1 of Richard Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences asserts that every man participating in a culture has three levels of conscious reflection: his specific ideas about things, his general beliefs or convictions, and his metaphysical dream of the world. It is at this latter level, the deepest of all, that Russell Kirk summoned conservatives to take issue with modernity. Modernity's metaphysical dream of the world took shape in the Enlightenment. It was a dream that henceforth humanity, guided by reason and the scientific method, would shape the world and human destiny by its own free choice, without reference to God. As Nietzsche in the next century put it, where is God? We have murdered him, you and I. The Enlightenment was, of course, the fount of many developments for both better and worse. It was, as we have seen, the source of the emphasis on the individual, and therefore upon both political and economic freedom that have flowered into democracy and free enterprise. But we must also recognize that in declaring man's independence from God, the Enlightenment became the vector of what Richard Pipes, in his History of the Bolshevik Revolution, calls perhaps the most pernicious idea in the history of thought: that man is merely a material compound, devoid of either soul or innate ideas, and as such a passive product of an infinitely malleable social environment. I'm sure I do not need to trace for you the appalling consequences spawned by that vicious assumption in the ensuing 2 centuries. Hundreds of millions of people have died in an attempt to validate one or another of its logical implications. It was against this hugely popular and immensely powerful metaphysical dream of the world that Russell Kirk defiantly raised the ancient banner of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the essentially religious dream of the world that had been dominant in the centuries before the Enlightenment and which he believed was infinitely superior to it. Of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition had retained many supporters in the 2 centuries after the Enlightenment, but it is not, I think, too much to say that by the middle of the 20th century it had almost totally lost its grip on elite intellectual opinion in the Western world. With the publication in 1933 of the Humanist Manifesto, signed by John Dewey and other prominent philosophers and described by the Encyclopedia Britannica as a profession of anthropological atheism based on the theory of evolution, the leading Western thinkers cut their remaining ties to the pre-Enlightenment Christian centuries and nailed to their mast the banner of what became known as secular humanism. 20 years had to pass before Russell Kirk published The Conservative Mind, and the philosophical battle was joined. Perhaps the most important reinforcement Kirk's position has since received occurred in 1978, when Alexander Solzhenitsyn rose to address the commencement audience at Harvard. His personal history and his intellectual force conduced to give his remarks special significance, but it was their unexpected content that made them resonate with such extraordinary power. Not surprisingly, the speech marked the point at which Solzhenitsyn fell from grace with the established elites of Western civilization and began to assume the lineaments with which he has subsequently been portrayed as a cranky old man, a prophet perhaps, but woefully out of step with the march of contemporary events. The transformation, of course, was inevitable, For in his speech, Solzhenitsyn did a quite extraordinary thing. He rejected secular humanism bag and baggage and called openly for the reintegration of the Judeo-Christian tradition into the ongoing culture of the West. In doing so, I believe he laid down much of the intellectual agenda of the 21st century. The mistake, he said, must be at the root, at the very basis of human thinking in the past centuries. I refer to the prevailing Western view of the world, which was first born during the Renaissance and found its political expression starting in the period of the Enlightenment. It became the basis for government and social science and could be defined as rationalistic humanism or humanist autonomy, the proclaimed and enforced autonomy of man from any higher force above him. Solzhenitsyn acknowledged that the Middle Ages had favored an intolerable despotic repression of man's physical nature in favor of the spiritual one. But modern Western civilization is based on the dangerous trend toward worshiping man and his material needs. The trend has now resulted in total liberation from the moral heritage of Christian centuries. All the glorified technological achievements of progress, including the conquest of outer space, do not redeem the 20th century's moral poverty. I am referring to the calamity of a despiritualized and irreligious humanistic consciousness. He concluded by calling crisply for dramatic change. It would be regression, he said, to attach oneself today to the ossified formulas of the Enlightenment. We cannot avoid revising the fundamental definitions of human life and human society. Is it true that man is above everything? Is there no higher spirit above him? If the world has not come to its end, it has approached a major turn in history, equal importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will exact from us a spiritual upsurge. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life. No one on earth has any way left but upward. It is amusing to speculate what Harvard must have thought of this spectacular eruption of anti-secularism in its 1978 commencement. But I suggest to you that in the long perspective of intellectual history, Solzhenitsyn's address may be the most memorable and most decisive ever given at Harvard. For he was sounding the trumpet for the opening of the final battle of conservatism, Russell Kirk's battle, the battle between two diametrically opposed metaphysical dreams of the world. How is the battle going? I was interested to read somewhere that the suave and witty Chinese communist leader Zhou Enlai, upon being asked about 1950 what he thought of the Enlightenment, replied, "It's too soon to tell." He recognized that for all the dominance of secular humanism among intellectuals, the battle was not yet won. Science, to which humanism looked for the ultimate answers, enjoyed enormous prestige, but still faced daunting challenges. The origins of life, and indeed of the universe itself, still eluded it. The jury, so to speak, was still out. Certainly the battle has been both long and hard. All of us are inescapably children of the Enlightenment. We have been taught from childhood, the knowledge has seeped into our very bones, that the materialist concept of reality is modernity's working model, and that in many ways it has worked wonderfully well. If religious convictions survive in us at all, they tend to be pushed into the background and treated as matters of strictly personal interest, without acknowledged relevance to society as a whole. And indeed, for many people, including many conservatives of a classical liberal bent, such convictions do not, in fact, survive. And yet I believe there are clear signs that the intellectual weather is changing. In the nearly 50 years since Zhou Enlai's cautious assessment, there have been some highly interesting developments. I'm speaking here of developments in the realm of science itself. In 1933, when the Humanist Manifesto was published, it seemed inevitable to its authors and to many others that the onward march of science would soon answer the few remaining really difficult questions about the nature of reality, after which anyone who chose to continue to believe in the existence of a divine creator would be free to indulge his fantasy without troubling the rest of the world about it. But in the past half-century, as science probed ever deeper into the secrets within the atom and peered ever further into the vast spaces beyond our galaxy, it has found itself face to face, not only with ever more difficult questions, but with questions which it appears that science, by its very nature, will be forever unable to answer. The central such question, of course, involves the origin of the universe. Just now, the most popular scientific explanation is that it originated in the so-called Big Bang, in which existence itself, together with such attributes as time and space, sprang into being from an infinitely small point and expanded with unimaginable speed and overwhelming velocity into the three-dimensional congeries of galaxies that we know today. Now, the concept of the Big Bang can perhaps explain many things, but what it cannot do, and what it appears science can never do, is explain what caused the bang. We are left, as mankind has been left since Aquinas, to posit a first cause uncaused, or, in other words, a creator. I have neither the time nor the necessary knowledge to take you on a journey along the frontiers of modern science and to point out the growing number of similar questions to which it appears that science not only does not have, but can never have the answers. Suffice it to say that again and again modern science reports encountering phenomena that seem permanently fated to defy its understanding. Some scientists deny this, of course, but by no means all of them. In 1991, I had the honor of moderating a conference of eminent scientists at the Claremont Institute on the subject of the permanent limitations of science. No view was excluded, and some of the speakers insisted, in effect, that science had no limitations. Henry Pierce Stapp, for one, long a senior staff physicist at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, professed to find a value system in the implications of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. But I think it is noteworthy that the former director of the laboratory, Dr. Edward Teller, made no such sweeping claim for science. He had been asked, he said, if somebody came to you and told you that on rational grounds, by which perhaps one means scientific grounds, we can resolve all the problems that face us humans, what would I think of such a man? I answered without hesitation, I would call such a person a monster. And the eminent biologist, Dr. Leon Cass, a member of the Committee on Social Thought of the University of Chicago, declared that for science, the nature and meaning of living beings and of life altogether will forever lie out of reach. Modern biology will never be able to tell us what life is, what is responsible for it, or what it is for. The task of harmonizing competing goods, both for any individual and especially among individuals who seek them variously, will always remain the work of a largely autonomous ethical and political science, helped, where possible, with insights mysteriously received from sources not under strict human command. Biology may do some of its finest work when it is brought to acknowledge and affirm the mysteries of the soul and the mysterious source of life, truth, and goodness. I suggest, therefore, that the really interesting question is what is going to happen when the fat and happy Enlightenment confidence in the omniscience of science encounters, as it is shortly bound to do, this sober realization on the part of scientists themselves that science does not have and will not have the answers to the truly fundamental questions that religion, specifically including the Judeo-Christian tradition, purports to answer. Now, public opinion polls have clearly established that the American people are already, or perhaps I should say still, the most religious-minded of all Western societies. In this respect, as in others, most Americans disagree with the intellectual elite. And in the past 20 years, we have seen a remarkable mobilization of a segment of religious believers for direct political action. In a sense, therefore, it can be said that the philosophical battle that Russell Kirk envisioned and Alexander Solzhenitsyn called for is already well and truly underway at the social and political level under the rubric of what is often called the culture war. If so, if what we have seen thus far is the shape the battle is going to take, we conservatives are going to have to prepare ourselves to lose many allies who fought at our side in the struggles against communism and democratic socialism. For many libertarians and some classical liberals are simply not ready to accept a metaphysical dream of the world that has a central religious component. By the same token, however, we can expect to gain immense numbers of recruits in some hitherto almost wholly inaccessible segments of the population, notably including both blacks and Hispanics. Over time, I am confident that the conservative movement will win this final battle too, and that Russell Kirk's vision of an America true to its creator will be realized. But let me suggest to you that the battle may not take the form I have described, a knockdown, drag-out, free-for-all between the remaining secular humanists and the regiments of the religious right. We have all witnessed occasions on which an unfashionable idea, but one with ultimately overwhelming justification, presents itself at the door of received opinion. At first, and for as long as possible, it will simply be ignored. Then it will be misrepresented and ridiculed. Next, it will be denounced. And then finally, it will, if it must, be accepted with the dismissive comment, well, we knew that all along. I suggest that this may be the final whimper of the intellectual elite, when the inadequacy of science to answer the ultimate questions is plain to everyone. It was Pascal who said that reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. If the battle between modernity and the Judeo-Christian tradition follows this second scenario, victory for the latter may come somewhat more quickly and painlessly than one might currently suppose. There are, I believe, immense moral reserves in the character of the American people, the heritage of those Christian centuries, still available to be drawn on in times of crisis. But it will be necessary for many Americans to put aside one all too convenient crutch, which is the legacy of the 60s, that decade in which 2 centuries after the Enlightenment and 30 years after the Humanist Manifesto, the moral bottom temporarily fell out of American society. I'm referring to the current, almost universal unwillingness to be judgmental. The problem, as usual, concerns the definition of the term. Every Christian knows that he must not judge lest he be judged, that he must forgive his neighbors their trespasses against him, that it is one of the properties of God himself always to have mercy. We are acutely aware of our own sins and feel in no position to cast the first stone. All this is true and of the very essence of Christianity. But this personal awareness of sin and our corresponding reluctance to condemn others must not be allowed to elide into the very different proposition that there is no such thing as an objective sin or an objective wrong, or that if there is, we are in no position to say so. If a sin or a wrong can never be identified and defined as such, then we have effectively banished all moral standards from human acknowledgement and denied them all human support. I do not believe this is what most Americans intend or in the long run will countenance. I believe that this country will, in the century ahead, acknowledge anew its dependence upon God and His laws and reincorporate that recognition into the ongoing cultural and intellectual tradition of the West. I do not want to be understood here as saying more than I have said. The differences among religions and among Christian denominations and liturgies will remain as vigorous in the 21st century as they have been in its predecessors. The distinction between the roles of church and state will remain and perhaps even sharpen as the churches awaken to a new realization of their obligations. But I do believe it is possible, and indeed likely, that by the end of the 21st century it will be common ground, not only among the vast majority of mankind, but among the intellectual elites, that realism at a minimum requires us to recognize the existence of a creator to whom mankind owes obligations that can only be described as moral. The achievement of that realization will constitute the third and final triumph of the conservative movement as we have known it. Beyond it, in the centuries ahead, we can hope that humanity will press on to a deeper and more ecumenical knowledge of its God and find in obedience to His will the only freedom worth having. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill, for those magnificent words and thoughts. We are grateful to you, my friend. I'd like to present you with, if I may, a copy of my collection of President's essays, which has just been published within the last week, and which includes an essay, of course, by Russell Kirk, and a reprint of Russell's portrait as it appears in our lobby. May I present that to you? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yes. Mr. Rusher has agreed to entertain comments or questions from anyone. Do we have any?
Yes, if self-professed conservatives are afraid or unwilling to take a stand on human life, whether it's inside or outside the womb, particularly in a procedure as outrageous and, as that can be as clearly seen in the light as partial birth infanticide, if they're unwilling to speak out on this issue, and if they choose as their leaders men such as Robert Dole or Newt Gingrich, who chose to divorce their first wives, even though those wives did not want them to divorce them, if this is the message that conservatives are giving to Americans, what is worth conserving as far as what's important both in now and hereafter?
Well, however timid conservatives may have been on some of the issues you raise, I think you will agree with me, we do not usually hold a candle to the liberals in any of these respects. My own feeling about such matters, at bottom, I gather my own position is not all that different from yours, perhaps in some ways, but not altogether. But I think that when you come to politics, which is famously defined as the art of the possible, you must make this important distinction. The so-called, well, we've noted already that Republican Party, in effect, is a coalition of economic conservatives and social conservatives. Economic issues can be faced and resolved more or less immediately. You don't have to wait around for public opinion very long. At any rate, it can be shaped and you can go on. Social issues are fundamental. They affect people at a much deeper level. And the wise politician knows this, and if he should be a virtuous man, his position is clear. But he does not expect, in respect of social issues, anything like the velocity of change that you can get with economic or other issues. Ronald Reagan saw that very clearly. We are engaged, to take your first issue, abortion, partial birth or otherwise, in a great national debate, which is by no means over. I have been saying for years that we, conservatives, and the so-called pro-life position are going to win that debate. Just recently, it has begun to appear that we are going to win that debate, that there is an actual shift of opinion measurable in the polls in our direction. It isn't over yet. It's not going to be over for a long time. But I think that American opinion is moving quite perceptibly in the correct direction. I have enough respect for the American people, it is after all their country, to let them proceed on this question at their pace. These are political questions, and they do not have, therefore, the imperative. You cannot translate the religious imperatives in the political sphere very easily, nor should you try. We try our best to make this a good society, and I think that in that respect we're going to do it. And the same would apply to the other social conservative imperatives, although what those may be, whether or not they require lifelong monogamy, is a question that might well be, I suppose, debated. But the main point to keep your eye on is that these things are not going to proceed with anything like the speed of other changes in the society, because they are fundamental, and that takes time. Yes?
Russell Kirk used to talk in praise of the Emperor Augustus because Augustus had imposed a kind of order on the Roman state when the Roman Republic had become fractured and disordered, and he had created a kind of system which endured, I guess you could say, until the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, so centuries. Now, when one thinks of Augustus, one thinks of an order that's imposed militarily. The liberals in our day seem to have a primordial tendency to corrupt the armed forces. Do you see that as an instinctual or a conscious effort to make it impossible to have an Augustan type of order established in the American civil social order?
Well, if I have read what Russell Kirk had to say on the subject of Augustus, I've forgotten. So I better be careful about exegetical work here on his behalf. But to answer what I take as your main point, I think the liberals in their attack on the armed forces are operating, as they very often do, at the instinctive level. And there is probably in it something of what you suggest is the will against order. But at the same time, I do not want to, and I'm sure you don't want to, have conservatism depicted as merely wanting some cast iron system of laws and order imposed upon a free society. This is not what we're after. But certainly it's uncanny almost how the assault on the armed forces has taken on the lineaments. You can so easily see what's being done, and I think it in due course will be undone. I think the level of the conversation has already reached the point where it's perfectly possible for people to say it's preposterous and not be hooted out of court altogether. Yes, sir.
First of all, I think that I agree with most of what the previous questioner said. I don't think he should think twice about treating divorced people out of the conservative movement because he eliminates Ronald Reagan people considered running for 2,000. My question, Mr. Rusher, is...
Not that they would be any great loss. Go ahead. Strike that from the record.
Agreeing with you about the 60s and rolling back a very terrible time, secular humanists argue that the genie was let out of the bottle during that period, that it's impossible to go back to a period such as the 50s, a golden age in our times, I think we'd all agree, and to go back to the morality and the more stringent and honorable behavior in God's eyes. Do you think it is possible to roll back the attitude of the 60s and return to a golden age in terms of morals?
Well, put that way, perhaps not. Nothing in a time-bound environment goes backward. History rolls only one direction, which is forward. Do I think things can improve? You bet I do, and I think they will. I think that the whole notion that the 60s were the cause of it all, while I can understand it, is a very shallow view of history. You have seen me this evening putting the root problem as far back as the Enlightenment, which is now over 2 centuries ago. Solzhenitsyn in his Harvard remarks says it began in the Renaissance and achieved its political form in the Enlightenment. Richard Weaver in his Ideas Have Consequences traces it back to William of Ockham and Ockham's razor. The Bible says it was all when Eve persuaded Adam to bite that apple. Did you ever see the cartoon? And then, I forget what, years ago, and some, maybe Collier's or something that old, showed an astronaut, 2 of them, coming out of a plane on an alien planet. And under a palm tree, there's a woman offering an apple to a man. The guy says, "Stop, stop." That's where it all began, of course. But no, we can, things do change. Look, if history is simply a progression, a disintegration, like the law of entropy, then it seems to me that you would have a hard time explaining even the 50s, which appeared so late in the day, historically speaking, let alone better times and better eras. There is a systole and diastole here, a yang and a yin, a back and a forth. And I think that we have had a good long free fall toward the bottom in recent decades, and I think we are about due to turn the corner. There are certainly plenty of signs that in relative terms we already have, perhaps. Was there over there then?
At one point in your lecture, you suggested that post-enlightenment modernity was the source of the emphasis on the individual and his freedom. And I wonder if that might not be to misconceive a little bit the relationship of the Enlightenment to the tradition, and maybe even to misconceive the relationship of the 2 halves of conservatism, at least if you observe that the Christian theological tradition itself was an earlier source of a kind of emphasis on the individual and his freedom, which was much more profound than that of the classical liberals. I suggest perhaps another way of putting it is that many of our current ideas are a kind of mutation of the great Judeo-Christian tradition rather than a displacement of it by something else.
I think that's a fair enough analysis. The Enlightenment itself did not develop ex nihilo. It came out of what had gone before, and what had gone before were the Christian centuries, including the concept of a creator and of man his creature, and of the obligations that he owes to God that have a lot of individualistic aspects to them, no question about that. What the Enlightenment did or sought to do was to have it all, to have all these nice things but get rid of God, you see, so that mankind hereafter could stand on his own as an autonomous individual. There was the big distinction and the sharp break. And it unfortunately is not just a after-dinner conversation. It had catastrophic, long-range, centuries-long consequences, of which the 60s were simply a blip on the historical record. Well, the boss has said that's it, so thank you very much.
Bill, on behalf of Annette Kirk and all of us at the Heritage Foundation, we thank you very, very much for being with us tonight on this very special occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to join us in the Van Andel Center for refreshments. Thank you, Annette.
American Perspectives continues in a moment with journalist Marcia